I know, guys. So I'm on chapter um 2 more chapters, guys. Page 100. The wound continued to burn for a long time. Siddhartha had to take many travelers across the river who had a son or a daughter with him, and he never laid his eyes on one of them without feeling envy, without thinking, so many people, so many thousands, possess this most wonderful of happiness. Why not I? Bad people, even thieves and bandits, have children, love them, and are loved by them in return. Only not me. So simple were his thoughts now, so without understanding, this is how much he had come to resemble the child people. Now he looked at people differently than he had before, less cleverly, with less pride, yet more warmly, with more curiosity and caring. When he took travelers of the usual kind across the river, child people, traders, warriors, women, these people no longer seemed alien to him as they once had. He understood them. He shared their life, a life guided not by ideas and insights, but only by impulses and desires. He felt as they did, although he was nearer to perfection and bore his last wound. It nevertheless seemed to him that these people were his brothers. Their vanities, appetites, and absurd traits had lost their absurdity for him. These traits had become comprehensible, lovable. He even experienced them as worthy of respect. The blind love of a mother for her child, the ignorant, blind pride of a conceited father over his only little son, the raw hunger of vain young women for jewelry and the admiring looks of men, all these impulses, all these childish qualities, all these simple and foolish but incredibly powerful, intensely vivid, forcefully dominant impulses and cravings were no longer childishness for Siddhartha. He saw that people lived for them, achieve an endless amount for them, travel, wage war, suffer, and preserve unendingly for them. And he could love them for that. He saw life that which is living, the indestructible essence, Brahman, and all of their passions, and each of their deeds. These people were worthy of love and admiration in their blind loyalty and their blind strength and tenacity. There was nothing they lacked. The wise men and thinker had nothing over them except one trifle, one little tiny thing, the awareness, the conscious idea of the unity of all life. And Siddhartha even doubted many a time that this knowledge, this idea was so very valuable. Was it not perhaps an example of the childishness of the think people, the intellectual version of the child people? The people of the world were the equals of the sages, and all else were often far superior to them, just as animals are often superior to human beings in the rough, unerring accomplishment of the necessary. There slowly bloomed and ripened in Siddhartha the realization and knowledge of what wisdom, the object of his long quest, really was. It was nothing more than a readiness of the soul, a mysterious knack, the ability at every moment in the midst of life to think the thought of unity, to feel and breathe unity. Gradually, this blossomed in him, shone back to him from the ancient child's face of Vasudeva, harmony, knowledge of the eternal perfection of the world, unity, a smile, knowledge of the eternal perfection of the world. But the wound still burned passionately and bitterly. Siddhartha dwelled on his son, nurtured the love and tenderness in his heart, let the pain of it consume him, indulged in all the foolishness of love. This was not a flame that went out by itself. One day when the wound was burning fiercely, Siddhartha crossed the river. Driven by longing, he climbed out of the boat, intending to go to the city and look for his son. The river was flowing gently and quietly. It was the dry season. But there was something unusual about its voice. It was laughing. It was clearly laughing. The river was laughing, loudly and plainly laughing at the old ferryman. Siddhartha stopped, bent over the water to hear better, and in the quietly moving water he saw the reflection of his face. In this reflected face there was something that recalled something forgotten, and as he thought about it, he remembered this face was like another face he had once known and loved and also feared. It resembled the face of his father, the Brahmin, and he remembered how long ago as a youth he had forced his father to let him go with the ascetics, how he had left him, gone off, and never returned. Had his father not felt the same pain over him that he now felt over his son? Had his father not long since died, alone without ever seeing his son again? Should he not expect the same fate himself? Was it not comical, a strange and stupid thing, this repetition, this movement in the same fateful circles? The river laughed. Yes, so it was. Everything returned that had not been suffered through to the end and resolved. The same pains were always suffered against. Siddhartha got back in the boat and rowed back to the hut, thinking of his father and of his son, with the river laughing at him, tending in his mind toward despair and tending not less toward joining in laughter at himself and the whole world. The wound was not flowering yet. His heart was still fighting his fate. Cheerfulness and victory had yet to shine forth from his chagrin. Chagrin. Chagrin? His chagrin, like a grin, but chagrin. But he felt hope, and when he got back to the hut, he had an he had an indomitable longing to open himself to Vasudeva, to expose everything to that master of listening, tell him everything. Vasudeva was sitting in the hut, weaving a basket. He no longer worked the bow. His eyes had begun to get weak, and his arms and hands too. All that remained unchanged, still glowing, was a joy and cheerful goodwill in his face. Siddhartha sat down by the old man and slowly began talking. Things that they had never talked about. He talked about now, about the time he had gone back to the city, about the burning wound, about his jealousy when he saw happy fathers, about knowing better about such desires and yet struggling in vain against them. He described everything. He was unable to say everything, even the most awkward things. Or he was able to say everything, the most awkward things. He was able to say everything, expose everything, recount everything. He described his wound, told about the events of the day, how he had crossed the river like a runaway child, intending to go to the city, and how the river had laughed. As he spoke and he went on for a long time, Vasudeva listened to him with his face still. And Siddhartha felt more than ever the power of Vasudeva's listening. He felt his pains and anxieties going over to him, crossing over and coming back from the other side. Exposing his wound to this listener was the same as bathing it in the river until it was cooled and became one with the water. As he went on speaking, continued to unbosom and confess himself, Siddhartha felt more and more that it was no longer Vasudeva, no longer a person who was listening to him, that this unmoving listener soaking up his confession into himself. As a tree draws in rain, this motionless being was the river itself, God himself, the eternal itself. When Siddhartha stopped thinking about himself and his wound, the knowledge of Vasudeva's changed nurture took possession of him, and the more he felt it and penetrated into it, the more wondrous it became. The more he realized that everything was in order, was natural, and he realized that Vasudeva had been that way for a long time, almost always. It was only he who had not completely recognized it. Yes, he realized that he himself hardly differed from Vasudeva anymore. He had the impression that he was now seeing old Vasudeva the way ordinary people see gods, and that this was not something that could last. He began to take leave of Vasudeva, in his heart, and all the while he went on talking. When Siddhartha talked himself out, Vasudeva turned his kindly, now weakened gaze on him, and without speaking, silently radiated love and cheerfulness to him, radiated understanding and wisdom. He took Siddhartha by the hand, led him to the seat on the riverbank, sat down with him at the river, smiling. You have heard him laugh, he said, but you have not heard everything. Let us listen, you will hear more. They listened softly. Softly came the many-voiced song of the river. Siddhartha looked into it, and in the moving water, images appeared to him. His father appeared alone, mourning for his son. He himself appeared alone, also tied with bonds of longing to his faraway son. His son appeared alone too, lustily storming along the burning pathway of his youthful desires. Each was bent on his object, each possessed by his object, each suffered. The river sang with the voice of suffering. Passionately it sang, passionately it flowed toward its goal, his voice lamenting. Do you hear? Asked Vasudeva's mute glance. Siddhartha nodded. Listen closer, whispered Vasudeva. Siddhartha made the effort to listen closer. The image of his father, his own image, the image of his son flowed into one another. Kamala's image also appeared and dissolved. Govinda's image and other images appeared and fused with one another, and all became the river. All moved as the river toward their objects, their goals, passionate, hungering, suffering. The river's voice was full of longing, ardent with sorrow, full of unquenchable longing. The river strove toward its goal. Siddhartha saw it hurrying on. This river composed of himself and those near him, and of all the people he had ever seen. All the waves and currents hurried onward, suffering towards objects. Many goals, the waterfall, the lake, the rapids, the sea, all the goals were reached, and each was followed by a new one, and the water became vapor and climbed into the sky, became rain and crashed down from the sky, became springs, brooks, became a river, strove onward again, flowed anew, but the passionate voice had changed. It still had the sound of suffering, questing, but other voices were added, voices of joy and suffering, good and evil voices, laughing and lamenting voices, 100, 1,000 voices. Siddhartha listened. He was now all listener, completely one with listening, completely empty, completely receptive. He felt now that he had completed his learning of how to listen. He had often heard all these things before, these many voices in the river, but today he heard it in a new way. Now he no longer distinguished the many voices, the happy from the grieving, the childlike from the manly. They were all part of each other. Longing laments, the laughter of the wise, cries of the anger, and the moans of the dying, all were one. All were interwoven and linked, intertwined in 1,000 ways. And everything together, all the voices, all the goals, all the striving, all the suffering, all the pleasure, everything together was the river of what is. was the river of what is, the music of life. And when Siddhartha listened attentively to the thousandfold song of the river, when he did not fasten on the suffering or the laughing, when he did not attach his mind to any one voice and become involved in it with his ego, when he listened to all of them, the whole, when he perceived the unity, then the great song of 1,000 voices formed one single word, perfection. Do you hear? Asked Vasudevada's eyes again. Bright shone Vasudevada's smile. It hovered, glowing in all the wrinkles of his aged countenance, just as the hovered over all the voices of the river. Bright shone his smile as he gazed at his friend, and now the same smile shone brightly in Siddhartha's face. His wound blossomed, his suffering was radiant, his ego had dissolved into the unity. At this moment, Siddhartha ceased to struggle with fate, ceased to suffer. On his face bloomed the cheerfulness of wisdom that is no longer opposed by will, that knows perfection, that is in harmony with the river of what is, with the current of life, full of compassion, full of empathetic joy, surrendered to the flow, part of the unity. As Vasudevada rose from the seat on the riverbank, as he looked into Siddhartha's eyes and saw the cheerfulness of wisdom radiant there, he touched his shoulder lightly with his hand in the considerate and tender way and said, I waited for this moment, dear friend. Now that it has come, let me go. I've long awaited this moment. I've long been the ferryman of Vasudevada. Now it is enough. Farewell, hut. Farewell, river. Farewell, Siddhartha. Siddhartha bowed low before the leave taker. I knew it, he said softly. You will go into the forest. I am going into the forest. I'm going into the unity, said Vasudevada, beaming. Beaming, he went his way. Siddhartha looked after him. With profound joy and profound seriousness, he looked after him, observed his tranquil walk, saw his countenance aglow, saw his form full of light.